Okay, it's 10 o'clock. Good morning, everybody. I'm Aina Zahari from Bursa Malaysia. I lead the PLC Transformation program. Thank you for attending our webinar this morning that will give you a walkthrough of the third book of our PLCT Transformation program. Today we have, I think there were almost 300 people who have signed up, so I think some more will trickle in, but we shall get started. Go to the next slide, Glenda. Next slide. So I think as most of you probably know, that's probably how you did find out. I believe most, if not all of you on the call today, your organization would have participated on the PLC transformation program, either as a participant or a champion to help drive best practices adoption in your respective companies or companies that you interact with, so that overall corporate Malaysia will improve in terms of performance. Next slide, please. So today specifically, we'll be covering stakeholder management and investor relations, which is the key topic for Guidebook 3 in a series of 5 guidebooks that we have under this program. The book, hopefully some of you have read it. If you go to the Bursa Malaysia website and just type PLC Transformation Program, you will see the 3 books that we have launched available for download. It's available publicly as a resource. So the purpose of this session today is to give a summary, if you will, so that those who may not have time to yet to read through the book, you also see what is being covered. And then also we have our guest speaker here, hopefully, and also the authors to help, co-authors to help you answer any questions. And also actually would like to see some of these sessions be a bit interactive, so feel free later during the session to ask questions or even share your best practices with one another, because that's really the spirit of the program that we'd like to have. Next slide. So as mentioned, there are 5 books in this series. Today we're going to deep dive on strengthening stakeholder management and investor relations. So I think some of you may be from the investor relations function, some may be leadership or of your respective PLC, some could be in communications, and there will be relevant bits for all of you, because I think the stakeholder management and investor relations in some way it does cut across various functions, because it is about communicating to our stakeholders, and they actually want to know on various aspects of the company. So our hope is that as you go through or hear about some of these practices, if you're adopting a lot of them already, great. If you hear about some tools that you may not have heard of, please please do take note and have a separate offline discussion with your co-workers later on to see what else you can do more, because we're all about promoting a little bit of improvements, so that overall we do have better stakeholder management and investor relations overall. Okay, next slide, Glenda. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry. I just heard a comment that might be not so clear. So if it recurs later when we do start with the presentation, do let us know. So today we'll kick off with Dominic and Glenda from PwC, who will run through highlights of the book itself. And then later on in the session, Rizal Ali, Vice President of Responsible Investment at KWAP, of course, one of the key institutional investors in Malaysia, will also share, from an institutional investor perspective, the expectations and also observations in engaging Malaysian companies to date. So over to you, Dominic.
Thanks, Aina. So very good morning to all. I hope you all can hear me well. So for the next session, really the heart of the session today, right? We'll take you through an overview of Guidebook 3 in terms of how basically it is actually conceived. Yeah. So Glenda and myself, will take you through over the next a couple of pages. And after that, would be really, really nice to hear from Rizal, from an institutional investor perspective. Next slide, please. Now, just to set the context, maybe slightly quickly, right? Again, how the book was actually brought together. We do take cognizance of obviously, the 900 over companies listed on Bursa Malaysia, right now. And some with regards to stakeholder management, investor relations, some of you obviously, maybe in the early part of your journey, and some obviously, much more mature, as Aina, mentioned earlier on. Now, the idea is really whereby we're trying to find the right balance, and some of these elements that's in the book, may apply to some of you in very specific circumstances and so forth, right? So it's meant to be used, in that context, cutting across the various sizes of PLCs, in our country. Now, on that context as well, what we've done is that, in pulling the book together, we've had the opportunity to engage various stakeholders, from the institutional investors themselves, to analysts, and so forth, to kind of get the perspective, and even, IR practitioners, for them to share the perspective in terms of how, investor relations, as a practice in Malaysia, how are we, how do we fare in its totality? And again, we've gotten those insightful information to be incorporated and infused in the book itself. Now, just one or two more things before, again, just expand a bit more. Now, one of the things that we really try to do in this book is to bring it to life. Right now, again, content, is contents in the book, but obviously, I think nothing brings to life more than real life examples, case studies, and even literatures and perspectives, from the various stakeholders. So in this book, one of the way we've kind of narrated is again bring those practice aids to life to help with implementation considerations. Now, just maybe let me take you through now how the entire book is actually framed. So if you look at this particular slide in front of you, right, we've brought the book together in the context of really 6 core chapters. Now, the first chapter is really finding a frame in terms of, the ecosystem of how, some of the components actually come together, starting with, in its most practicality, right, where we engage stakeholders and so forth. What's really the purpose at the end of the day? Whether it's from building trust to improving transparency, there must be a problem statement that we really want to manage or information that we want to share. Now, on a very practical note, in that context, when we start to really drill down, obviously, we will then realize that, again, there are multiple stakeholders in every institution or organization that we need to manage, right? It's not only the shareholders, stakeholders are also your employees, your suppliers, and so forth. And then basically alluding to that is what are then, whether we call it communication channels, or how do you then engage them accordingly, right? In that context, with regards to your stakeholders and the purpose and the narrative that you want to put out there. So the initial chapter is just to set the context of how we really pull, the context together and how it relates to the subsequent chapters accordingly. Now, the second chapter then kind of touches upon, the fundamentals of stakeholder management. Now, in this example, or in this particular chapter, really the idea is, finding a process of how we go about identifying who are the key stakeholders, obviously within certain circumstances and realms, within the organization, right? It must be very specific to a particular problem statement or a situation that you're trying to manage. So in some of the examples, for example, in the book, you would see case studies on Sunway, very specific to, the sustainability assessment in terms of identifying, from their stakeholders and the input, what impacts their organization, and how they then come up with intervention plans or strategies, right, to manage that particular circumstances. Again, it is used in a very specific manner. Yeah. So going back to the point, it needs to be applied in the context of the organization itself. Now, not only that, again, from a very pragmatic perspective, the whole ideation is, yes, knowing who are your key stakeholders, which then leads to how you then kind of engage them accordingly, and what are the triggers that's needed, that kind of promulgates, the need to actually engage them, in terms of frequency, how, and so forth. Yeah. Now, it then kind of leads to chapter 3, which is, again, a very core fundamental chapter of the book, which touches upon really, what investor relations is at the end of the day, right? Now, I think the spirit of the matter here is that I think all of us understand that, the role of investor relations has really elevated, over the last many, many years, right? Maybe again, 2 decades ago and so forth, our perspective on investor relations in comparison to fast forward year 2022, it has really, really elevated. And again, whether it's from literature, from, perspective of board members and so forth, a lot of people, we do see that this role is a very significant role and requires the mandate and the level of seniority within organizations for the investor relations role to execute their mandate accordingly as well. We've also gotten, a lot of, as part of the exercise in putting the book together, we've ran a couple of surveys with, again, the institutional investors, the investor community, to get their views and their expectations of the investor relations activity and how this is basically kind of then incorporated into the expectations of the book. Yeah. Now, which then leads on to chapter number 4 on communication channels. Obviously, it is about how do you then basically engage, right, with your relevant stakeholders, depending on the stakeholder group itself. Now, in this particular chapter, we've broken it down into big categories of what are potential communication tools or channels to consider. Now, obviously, we have the formal channels that we're used to, whether it's AGMs, annual reports, and so forth. But I think we also, all of us, also realize, right, the rising importance of how we use complementary channels such as social media and so forth. And I think, again, in our society today, we cannot disregard, right, the importance of how we relay information in social media and how do we, again, listen to our community in terms of getting feedback, via many of these tools, and channels out there. Yeah? Now, which then maybe I ask you to focus on the second row within, on the lower part of the slide, right? We then move on to a chapter on crisis communications. Now, how this chapter was actually conceived was really, again, to be very real about it, it's really easy to communicate during the good times, right? But when it comes to times of crisis, bad news, how do we really kind of manage those situations? And this really the reason as to why we thought of importance to communicate and engage with stakeholders during times of crisis. Yeah, which kind of leads to the final chapter as to what are then the enablers to help us basically enable the whole spirit of, again, managing stakeholders. How do we institutionalize a culture of communication within the institution, and what are the components and enablers needed, to support this idea? And that's how chapter 6 is basically brought together as well. Here, we'll speak about 4 key domains, 4 key sub-attributes, if I may call it that way. One, from a leadership and culture perspective, how do you, again, bring to life, a behavior of, communication? And I think all of us also realize that, leaders do play a very important role, right? Many of us, many companies associate, themselves with the leaders who are the face of the institutions and so forth. So again, if we go to the content of the books, there are literature, there are studies and research that demonstrates the correlation between, how as an investor, how someone actually reacts vis-a-vis, what a CEO says as an example, right? Now, the other three attributes, which is, I think it's not common. Obviously, it's the use of data, in similar to any other aspect. How do we leverage off data, right? Again, in the context of investor relations, for us to actually disseminate, relevant and right information in a timely manner out there, right? We also talk about tools. What are the tools that's available these days for investor relations to execute their work, more efficiently, right? And last but not least, I think all of us would agree that, whilst it's great to have a lot of plans, we also need to measure and monitor how effective those plans are, which is kind of the fourth attribute within the enablers. How do you then measure the effectiveness of your investor relations program at the end of the day, right? And we've brought that via, many examples, where from an outcome lens perspective, also from a task and activity lens perspective to balance it off, yeah? Now, next slide, please. Now, I've touched on this, a bit earlier on. Obviously, we want to bring to life, the contents of the book. And nothing, as I mentioned earlier on, nothing beats the fact that we're able to experience from, past lessons learned, views from, various stakeholders within the investor relations community, and so forth. So if you look at really the four columns in this particular slide, what we try to do, and obviously it's non-exhaustive, we've put in practice aids, tools to, for those that, maybe you're starting, some of the things for you to consider as a starting base to help with the early part of your journey. What's really nice as well is that we've managed to also get insights from, from two distinct institutional investors, EPF and PNB. There's a video in there about, how, what's their expectations as an institutional investor, in terms of how they go about engaging companies or targeting companies and so forth. Again, how they would expect as investee companies to engage them, how should the communication be and so forth, right? Now, what's really, really nice today as well is, as Aina has introduced, not only that we have EPF and PNB, we have Rizal from KWAP today, another very distinguished, institutional investor, here this morning, again, to reiterate and share their perspectives, again, in terms of how and what they are looking for from an IR perspective and how, they engagements with, some of the investee companies and so forth, yeah. Now, all this is anchored with a lot of case studies, whether it is locally or global case studies. Again, we're very fortunate. We have we've managed again from Sunway perspective and from DG, the head of investor relations, for them to share again how they manage their functions within a very sizable group, right? Again, all this bringing to life, the contents of the book. And last but not least, supported by, like I said, literatures and research, materials out there as well. Yeah. So in a broad frame of things, right, that's how really the book narrative is brought to life. Yeah? Now, I'm going to now go to, each chapter of the book. And Glenda and myself will take through, some of the key chapters. And what are some of the key salient points for all of you to take note of. Yeah. Now, obviously, this is just a highlight of the book. There are many other contents within the book itself. Yeah. Next slide, please. As I kind of mentioned, and I don't want to repeat myself, members of the audience, is that, we started the book whereby, let's frame it together, right? To give a guide as to how, as a reader, how do we take through the book accordingly? And we thought what we used was really looking at it from a broader lens, whereby, let's start with maybe 6 core attributes that we want to kind of infuse within book 3. So starting again with really, as a start, obviously there must be an intent, right? And an outcome perspective as to why, we want to engage and what kind of information that we want to disseminate out there, whether again from a building trust perspective, if you focus your lens on, the higher bar and role to begin with, right? Whether it's about building trust, giving confidence, or improving transparency, there must be an intent and outcome driven by it, yeah? Now, again, as I've alluded to earlier, stakeholder groups these days are not just shareholders, right? I think we all agree that there is a rise in stakeholder activism, whether it's from NGOs, communities, governments, suppliers, customers, employees, and so forth. And I think in terms of the strategy that all of you do in your organizations, do consider, how some of these stakeholders are impacted in our decisions at the end of the day, right? So again, we need to consider how, the correlation between what we want to put out there to the stakeholders that we want to engage and communicate. Yeah. Now, facets is in the context of really what are some of the triggers, I mean, I use the word trigger in terms of, what do you want to put out there as well, right? So as an example, I've touched upon the matter of crisis. Would crisis be a trigger of how you communicate to relevant stakeholders? Tying back to the purpose that I mentioned earlier on, to continue to give transparency on making sure that, again, trust is actually maintained in a time of crisis. And that's how we see the correlation between each of the chapters at the end of the day. Now, channels, as I mentioned, as you can see now, we've started to then kind of break it down into the various channels that can be, used by, by all of you. And again, it doesn't mean that you need to use every single channel out there. It is about finding the right channel that allows you to communicate with your own stakeholders, in the most effective way. We are just giving, variations and options to consider and the benefits surrounding it. Yeah? Now, the enablers, not going to touch too much on this. I've kind of spoken about it. And I think Glenda is going to touch a bit more in terms of some of the intricacies of, these 4 attributes within the enablers at the end of the day. And last but not least, I think one of the key spirit or points, and I'm sure a lot of the IR practitioners in the audience today would agree with me that, IR is not the accountability or the role of just one party, right? I mean, for IR to operate effectively, there is a big correlation and interdependency in terms of the information they receive for them to be able to collate and then, disseminate those information out to the market accordingly. So again, we see a very close interloop and relation between, say, IR and, say, the marketing department, IR with finance, so they can get the right financial information to disseminate. And even in a time of crisis, as an example, right? With the BCM team, again, how do you get the right information, managing, all the stakeholders at the end of the day. So again, it is an interdependency and ecosystem for IR to operate, accordingly as well. Yeah. Now, next slide, please. Now, maybe before, what we thought would be kind of nice, again, just to get, some of the rhythm started, right? We have, again, there's no right or wrong, ladies and gentlemen. We're not here to gauge, good or bad, but maybe just to get a flavor in terms of the participants today, right? We have a Mentimeter. If you can actually go to menti.com and enter the code, we just have a quick question, maybe just to gauge in terms of currently how your your IR establishment is set up within your company. Is this something a bit more established, a bit more formal, or something whereby, again, it's a bit more, say, ad hoc at the end of the day? As a start, do you mind maybe getting onto menti.com? And the code is 272333851. And we can get, some of this, self-assessment started to begin with. And we'll share, obviously, the results after this accordingly as well. Yes, sorry, you may scan the QR code as well, too. Thank you, Jason. I think we have about 261 participants today. Really, really good number. Thank you for turning out on a Thursday morning. Can someone maybe just share with me, the state of the mentee participants? So maybe then we can. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing and participating. I mean, just looking at the initial feedback, I think it's very promising to see that, at least we see again some companies, IR is seen as a very vital function as part of senior management. And again, a balance of obviously companies having very established IR function as well. I think in the last column, IR as an activity, I think people do see its importance. It's just how do we kind of integrate it into existing activities and so forth. Okay, thank you for that. We're not going to hold it too long. Again, the idea is not to assess right or wrong. Again, this is just to gauge, whether at the end of the day, we hope that, from the book itself, you're able to leverage some of the key components, right, for you to apply, and again, bring benefit to your organization. Yeah. Now, I'm going to close the mentee. Can we go to the next one, please? I think that's the second question, right? Now, very, very similarly, right? Can we just also maybe, again, this is just two questions, right? From a stakeholder management perspective mapping, right? Again, maybe it's, every company will have different circumstances at the end of the day. As I mentioned earlier on, I used the example of Sunway Group. Their purpose of stakeholder mapping was for a very specific scenario, right? Or situation. Looking at the question here, again, I think it reads for itself. Can I just maybe get your lens again as to, from your own company's perspective, your own circumstances, whether stakeholder mapping is something well institutionalized within your organization for your specific reasons. Again, I think we see a balance, a myriad of answers at the end of the day. We just hold on for another maybe 20, 30 seconds, and then, we'll. Again, it's very nice to see, obviously, I think some companies may be a bit more mature, who have well institutionalized, again, the whole stakeholder engagement mapping process in place. So in some, obviously, you're in your early journey as well. And I think it's also very promising that there's an intent to do so, and formalize or institutionalize, that process accordingly. So in the next chapter, right, we will then talk about basically, from chapter 2, from a stakeholder management perspective, what are some of the tools that you can actually consider, and also case studies of how, others have used it, right? Again, going back to the intent and purpose at the end of the day. So thank you very much for participating in the initial mentee. We have again two more questions later down the road. But let's just get back to the the sharing of the guidebook today. Now, very nicely from the second question, it then kind of links to the second chapter, not second part of the book, right? Here, as the title really speaks for itself, it's really about stakeholder management. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, obviously we do stakeholder management depending on the circumstances and the specific problem statements that we are looking at. Again, I'm coming from a problem statement perspective, not from a negative connotation lens. Yeah, members. Again, it depends on what's really the matter that we're trying to manage at the end of the day. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the cycle, but in a bigger spirit of things, which I believe you all would agree with me, we need to first understand who are the stakeholder groups that we're really trying to engage, right? Now, having kind of understand who are the stakeholder groups that may be impacted by our actions, right? We need to then kind of analyze and analyze their level of power and influence, over our actions and so forth, so that again we understand how to engage these people accordingly in a very practical manner, and what are the right tools to actually engage them, going back to say communication channels and so forth. Now, obviously, different stakeholders would again require different type of information, different level of frequency of engagement, and so forth. It doesn't mean that there's every single stakeholder will require similar types of engagement, and this is how we then manage and use our resources accordingly to optimize the engagement plans and so forth. So the stakeholder management and business performance chapter is built to articulate that process for us to consider. Now, obviously, there are also trigger points similarly as to when do we kind of go about and engage these stakeholders, whether it's in a context whereby it could be where, say, a launch of a new product portfolio or launch of a new strategy that again you want to share those information and equip your investors, your suppliers and so forth, or from the further extreme, maybe in the context of, say, again a crisis perspective, needing to again communicate and manage, right, the anticipation, by some of your other stakeholders and so forth. So again, triggers could be a myriad of things from a business perspective, from a situation perspective, that allow us and require, organizations and investor relations to disseminate the right information out there. Now, the diagram on the right is just a representation as an example of how, Sunway, as I mentioned, undertakes it for their own sustainability maturity assessment. Yeah. So you can read some of this case studies in the book, and within there itself, if you would like more information, all the links are actually provided, back to the source information, for you to, get a better read, in terms of the details at the end of the day. Yeah. Now, next slide, please. So a lot of again, as part of the spirit of bringing to life, we've supported with, whether it's authoritative literature, findings, studies by relevant, parties and so forth. And also, again, case studies, as I mentioned, in terms of how, companies have used, stakeholder management for the purpose of their strategy at the end of the day. So again, on your left, just very quickly, sometimes, we may look at stakeholder management in a very, I wouldn't say trivial, can't find the right word, but again, the emphasis given to stakeholder management may not be that well formalized or institutionalized. But again, if you look at, again, some of the studies by even McKinsey in terms of their, I think, surveys with senior management and board members, it has become a very key topic of how, board members and senior management are thinking as to the need, again, to engage stakeholders in a very, well-planned manner, rather than unintentional. Yeah. So again, there are studies to kind of support that as well. And, to the far right of the diagram, going back to what I mentioned, how, companies are using, and engaging stakeholders in terms of whether it's for their own products, or engaging their customers and so forth, how they've used it to their benefit, and so forth. So you look at, say, Fitbit, right? I'm sure most of us would have a Fitbit in some form of another. So very nicely, we look at how Fitbit is using social listening for them to, upgrade and enhance their product portfolios at the end of the day. Yeah. Next slide, please. So for every chapter, obviously we will end with implementation considerations. I'm not going to read through each line by line, members. A lot of this content is really in the book, but as I mentioned, the spirit of the matter is really about again understanding who are your stakeholder groups within the problem statement that you really want to manage, understand their expectations, and again, how do you communicate with them accordingly. Now, some of these tools and ideas is further elaborated, obviously, in chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5, within the guidebook itself. And if for some of the Arsenal fans in this group today, I'm sure you're really happy. After eight games, you are top of the league. Unfortunately, I'm a Liverpool fan, so I do not share your joy. But again, looking at Arsenal Football Club, even again, there are tools that we've kind of inculcated in the book, ladies and gentlemen, and the Mendel's matrix is one of them as well. How do you identify stakeholders? How do you prioritize them accordingly? And then from that context, how do you then engage with the right communication and engagement strategy? Yeah. Now, the Mendel's tool here is just one of many tools out there, right? I'm sure there are a myriad of other stakeholder mapping tools that you all can consider, but this is just to give a guidance and a flavor of what's available out there. All right. Now, next slide, please. Now, obviously, one of the key heart of as the title speaks itself, investor relations, right? We want to focus on the importance and the elevated role and expectation of the investor relations function, department or designation, right? And as I started off earlier, in a lot of the research, and I think the people that we spoke with in terms of stakeholders, I think we can conclude that the rise of the importance of the investor relations function at the end of the day, no longer as it is seen as something, again, pardon my words, administrative, but something of a very strategic nature, right? That warrants a really senior position within the organization and the conduit, to manage, the external stakeholders and the conduit between the CEOs and boards of the companies to these external stakeholders at the end of the day, right? Again, if we were to review a lot of literature out there, I think the conclusion, really focuses on the importance of the role and how it has really, really changed. What we've also done, as I mentioned earlier, as part of not only just Book 3, but as part of the entire PLCT program, the transformation program, we've ran against certain surveys or interviews with various stakeholders and gotten their feedback, whether it's again from analysts, institutional investors, board members, and so forth, for them to really kind of give us insight as to, what are some of the transformation, initiatives needed, what do they expect of PLCs? And again, how does that translate then in the context of Book 3, the role of investor relations activity? Now, obviously, one of the things that, all of us I'm surely familiar with, obviously, is the importance of, again, or the rise of disclosure requirements, right? So again, from the context of, say, as investor relations, how do we ensure the right information gets disseminated in terms of the disclosure expectations, to the relevant parties at the end of the day, yeah? And last but not least, and I've touched upon this earlier on, is that, the role of investor relations is just not the accountability of one, yeah? To bring the best out of investor relations, there's a lot of dependency in terms of information furnishing to the investor relations for them to, again, manage those external stakeholders accordingly as well, based on the circumstances that I mentioned. So in the book, we've given certain narrative and scenarios as to how various functions within an organization collaborate with investor relations, right, to, again, engage the external community accordingly as well. Yeah. Now, on the far side is just to add certain statistics or research to the book. We've also came across studies that demonstrated how investors are influenced or affected right, by how IR carry out their activities, and it does influence the way they look at valuations and so forth. So again, there are some nice studies out there that kind of demonstrate the correlation between the importance of the role of IR and how it actually affects the valuation of a company and so forth, based on the activities, obviously, and the way they disseminate the information out there in terms of the performance of the company. Yeah. Now, next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier on as well, don't want to sound like a broken record, and we've been very fortunate, right? We've gotten, again, from EPF and from PMB, a specific video recording, right? From Puan Rohaya and also from Insek Sheikh, for them to share from their own EPF and PMB's perspective, what do they really look for, right? Again, when they're targeting a company, and vice versa, in terms of the expectations they would like, in terms of their investing companies, in terms of engaging with them accordingly as well. Yeah. So a lot of the attributes of what they've raised is actually again infused and inculcated in the book accordingly as well. But what we thought would be very nice is to get a lens from from the institutional investors as to their expectations from companies and also the investor relations function. And today, as I mentioned, we are also very fortunate to have Rizal from KWAP, again to add on to that perspective, in the coming session. Yeah. Next slide, please. So, building on from what I mentioned earlier on, we started book 3 with the perspective of, what's investor relations, again, the definition and the expected role, as I mentioned, and again, looking at just the role of investor relations, right, and focusing on just one particular page within that chapter itself, dealing with the investor community is not just institutional investors. Again, it's a myriad of many other stakeholders out there, whether it's retail investors, analysts, rating agencies, financial institutions, even regulators, right? So again, it demonstrates the importance of investor relations as to, again, scanning the environment and knowing, who are the stakeholders that really need to manage at the end of the day. Yeah. Now, the following slide further kind of expands on some of the roles, the mandate, which I will not touch upon today. I think it is easily accessible in the book itself. But again, it talks about that elevated role. Yeah. Next slide, please. So this slide kind of shows what I've mentioned earlier on already. We've been fortunate that I think we've ran, 2-3 surveys over the last couple of months. Not only, again, it's not only for book 3, but for the various books to get insights in terms of some of the expectations on PLCs. And we've translated that in terms of, again, the expectation from an investor relations and communication lens. How does it affect investor relations in terms of what they want to communicate out there as well, right? Whether it's in terms of disclosure requirements, obviously certain things like we know obviously sustainability agenda is a key agenda for all of us in this current climate, and how then again as an organization, from an investor relations perspective, how do we ensure, again, those disclosures, those information are well disseminated accordingly. Yeah. It also brings to light the competencies required of an investor relations professional. It's not just being financial savvy, investment savvy, but again, the ability to understand multiple domains for them to also share, to the market participants out there, right? Now, again, one of the things that we always take note of is that, from a competency lens perspective, it's not easy being an investor relations officer these days, right? Again, as I mentioned earlier on, I think the knowledge that's required, because you are a representation of the company at the end of the day, and people look up to you for you to furnish those right information, whether it's an internal stakeholders like board members. Again, you are the conduit between internal and the external parties at the end of the day. So again, a very crucial role, right, to be recognized. The diagram on the right, again, is just a snapshot of the page. We want to represent again that, again, to make investor relations the mandate, to deliver the mandate effectively, right, you require collaboration and the right information flow within the organization, right? So whether again is from a crisis perspective, also from a change in business strategy perspective, depending on scenarios, right? Obviously, investor relations would then have a role to manage certain communication. So the idea is, how do you then work with, say, parties like the company secretary, corporate strategy, digital communications to ensure a consistency of message going out there, again, of relevance and timeliness as well. Yeah. So again, it's not about the accountability of one. So for chapter number 3, that's how we've kind of conceived the chapter in terms of the importance of investor relations. And the following chapter really talks about now, what are some of the communication channels that's available out there? Yeah. Without further ado, I'm going to pass to my colleague Glenda, who's going to take us through the rest of the chapters. Over to you, Glenda.
Thanks, Dom. Can you, if you don't mind, to move to slide 21? Yeah. Okay, so Dom has shared quite a lot about how we've conceived the first 3 chapters. So I'd like to share with yourselves in terms of the communication channels. So after you've done the stakeholder management assessment, after you've established how you would run the investor relations function, then I think it's very critical that we think about how do we communicate the messages, right? And when we think about communication, we've all had our good share of good and bad experiences. So what we've done as part of the book, and I'll share with you in the next slide on which page, is that we've tried to put together a lens of what constitutes good and what constitutes bad form of communication. And as we all know, bad communication will lead to further distress, right? So we've got some case studies, we've got some videos for yourselves. If you flip through the book to go to those specifics and have a look to see what resonates and what you can take away as best practices for your own organization. In addition to that, I think we've also tried to put together what are the formal and emerging complementary channels. Perhaps pre-COVID, a lot of communication was determined to be formal, right? From an investor relations lens, you will have to have your AGM in person, you book a hotel and all that stuff, right? But in the journey of going through COVID and now even post-COVID, a lot of things have changed in this formal so-called landscape. A lot of things have gone on the virtual platform, just like what we're doing today, right? So we also explore that lens within our book and given you some examples and case studies of how other organizations, both internationally as well as locally, have used this effectively in our view. And when we talk about emerging and complementary channel, we cannot go away thinking that, we're no longer, we can ignore what gets spoken about us in the social media, on the internet. I think that will be a very archaic kind of thought. So moving forward, how do we then effectively use these emerging and complementary channels to reach out to our stakeholders that we've established as part of the stakeholder management matrices? So that's also something that we've included in our book. And I think the key to communication is that, so what if I write so much or I say so much? Does it really, really make a difference? Does it convince you as users to be able to want to do this and spend the better part of your time at work to do this? Or is it better spent doing something else? And when we look at the statistics, as you can see on the right hand side of this slide, is that integrated reporting has shown as part of our survey to demonstrate that there are benefits to this, right? And in the survey, it shows that there is a statistics, or there's like a bigger majority of the people believing that better understanding, improvements in decision making, more collaborative thinking goes beyond having this information shared out there. So it's not just like, oh, I go through the blood, sweat, and tears of putting together integrated reporting for my company, and then nobody looks at it, right? There's a lot more value in it, and I think statistics have proven to show this. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. These are just some snippets from our book, which illustrate the formal as well as the emerging and complementary channels as I've shared earlier, right? All these are publicly available information of which we've tried to illustrate, for example, on the left-hand side, how Maybank has an investor pack for their investor day in 2021, right? Sharing with the wider public, what do they have as part of their strategic journey? Where do they aspire to be? And what are their key strategic objectives? In the old days, a lot of this will be top secret, right? Oh, you cannot know what is my trademark. How do I want to grow? But moving forward, this is the way that people are thinking. The more that I share out there, perhaps it's better influence on the market. And as PLCs, it is in your benefit, I believe, that the more you share accurate information, transparency is the way to go. Similarly, on the social media platform, right? You cannot stop people, you cannot stop the trolls from writing whatever they like on the social media. This is the way it is, right? But what you can do is to plan for it, right? How do you communicate in your own way that is specific to your own organization's culture? And as you can see in the statistics that we have put together in the book, that we cannot run away from this fact because so big population of Malaysia is now connected by the internet and the social media penetration is really, really high, right? So we cannot shy away from this fact, and we have some tips and tricks in the book that we will share, right? In the next slide, we have also that was on the left hand side is the communication channels, the good and bad to it, and we've got those videos and those links so that I shared on the first slide that I took over from Dom. And we also had the privilege of interviewing a former CNBC presenter, Mark Laudy, and he has given us the some key takeaways, right? And actually, the thing that I found very that resonates a lot from what he shared with us at that session was that a lot of us have these blockers, right? So the last point on this slide about unblocking the blockers, we think that people don't want to hear us, there's nothing interesting for us to share, but actually he says that it's all in our mind. And he has done so many sort of training sessions for the C-suite members that it is trying to get ourselves out there to be media savvy, to in a way face up with our fears, right? To talk to the general public or communicate those messages. Because if you shy away, the least or rather the worst that can happen is that people will misinterpret what is actually happening when actually you have a good story to tell, and the keywords are credible, authentic, and sincere. So have a look at the video that Mark has kindly allowed us to film and put into the book. If you move to the next slide, yeah, we've also done a quick study, if you see on the left-hand side, on the type of information that the different type of companies listed on Bursa have shown, right? I think it's no big secret that obviously the main market companies have majority of the information, whilst the Ace and Leap companies are still in the midst of building that information up, right? So the aspiration from those of yourselves on the call, if you look into the book, right, specific pages are on the slides here, in terms of what are the PLCs or the main market PLCs doing, it will give you some insights as well. And another part of the emerging and complementary channels that we thought was quite interesting is that it's not just about social media or what's on the web, but there are many other complementary channels for communication. So think about it, your employees, right? Those who work with you, they are your brand ambassadors. How do you communicate to them? Do they know what are your targets? What are your strategic objectives? How do they share, and what is their own persona when they go out and say meet clients in carrying your PLC brand, right? The communities, now it's all about us helping each other within the community. How do you contribute to it? It's not just about CSR, but it's about the type of work that you do. It's so big, right? Book 2 in the Bursa, the lens, what Guidebook 2 was all about ESG. Right. So how do you build the communities that take us into the future, if that's one of the strategic visions that your company have? And so we need to consider and think about these channels and the impact of these channels in your PLC's performance as well. right? Suppliers and vendors, how do you deal with them? Definitely will have an impact, right? Who do you select as your suppliers and vendors, and how they communicate about yourselves directly or indirectly will definitely also have an impact. So we have some of these lenses that we've added to the book to give it additional areas for your consideration as well. Now, if we move to the next slide, please. As similar to the other chapters, we also have a list of areas for consideration to come out to yourselves as it being real, right? But the key thing when it comes to communication, as I've shared earlier, it's about the accuracy, the timeliness, the transparency, and making sure that the information out there is credible, right? And in order to do that, you must make sure that there are mechanisms, controls, processes in place for you to tell your story in the way that you want it to be told, right? So if you look at the quotes on the right hand side, these are quotes not created by Dom and I, but they are extracted across the various information in the internet. And I actually really like the second quote on the right hand side, right? So if you have time, you look at the quotes that we have in the book. There are also things that we found very insightful and thought-provoking. That's why we've added it into the book. Okay. Now that's on communication channel. Now, if we move to the next slide, crisis communication. Don started off with sharing about the chapters in the book, and he talked about crisis communication being one of the key areas that we thought would be very important to share with the readers of the book. And I cannot resonate more, right? For the mere fact that if you think about it, telling good news is very much easier than being the bearer of bad news. If there is bad news to be told, nobody likes to carry and convey that message across. But as leaders of organizations in the Malaysian PLCs, right, crisis communication, we truly believe that it is important in managing who you are communicating to, how are you communicating with them, and what are the mechanisms to ensure that this communication is done effectively and in the right manner and carrying the right message that you want to carry across. And EPF, if you can see, if you remember the fire back in 2018, has done a pretty good job in sharing and planning for it, right? If you see how they have had their teams in place, there were public address to what has happened, and they even addressed the rumors, right? So it's a combination of a different type of formal as well as sort of complementary channels as well. If we move to the next slide, yeah, if you think that crisis communication is just a fad, we have a study shown in the book that shows that actually crisis communication is not just for the sake of communicating. There is a real impact on the share price, as we can see here, right? And hence, failure to communicate in time of crisis could be detrimental to your organization. And therefore, planning for a crisis is important, right? There has to be certain setup of the teams. There has to be certain things that you do. And all this you do not do in time of crisis, right? And so within the book, we've also infused how and what are the things that you can consider in communication in crisis that you should take on in the good times, right? So that's also infused into our book. Now, if we move to the next slide, here are some of the key considerations that we have put together and also for yourselves to consider. And there's more detail of it in the book, right? Making sure that you are ready in time of crisis, right? So yeah, for example, if the electricity were to go off in my house today, what do? Where's my torchlight? All those things need to be in place because in times of crisis, you cannot scramble. So do you have your holding statements, your press release? Is everyone in the know? How are the teams set up? Have they been trained? Have they done a dry run? All those things are actually part and parcel of what we've shared within the book for your consideration in applying crisis communication in your organization, right? So the quote on the right-hand side is also something that you can read if you're not convinced that the crisis communication will add value to your organization, or at least there's no deterioration in value in the event that you communicate effectively in the time of crisis. Okay, So we then move on to the very last chapter of our book, the enablers. So having said all the good stuff, how do you enable it? And Dom has gone through this last chapter, thought process and construct at the beginning, right? We believe that it comes in 4 different areas. Talking about leadership and culture, tone from the top is definitely very important. And as part of the DG interview that Dom shared, you will hear that the head of IR there say that she couldn't have done it without her C-suite leadership team, right? So we believe also that that is a very key thing, and with the data as well, allowing insights into what your stakeholders are looking for, right? And it will help with pulling through what information you should or shouldn't share out there. And of course, metrics, right? I truly believe what gets measured gets done, right? So at the end of the day, if we are not measured to our performance, obviously it will be the last, if not dropping off our list of things to do. We got so many things in a day to worry about. And therefore, if you were to implement some of the action items that were proposed to be included in our book, we also propose having some form of measurement to be able to track how effective these initiatives have been in terms of performance, as well as the improvement thereafter. And we cannot run away that today's world, we need to have technology enablers, right? Be it something you procure or something you build in-house, right? The effectiveness of using these tools to communicate, to provide the necessary, accurate, transparent information should not be ignored lah, if you were to embark on this journey. So now if we move on to the next slide, we have in each of the 4 pillars under enablers, a lot of detail articulating how and what are available out there that you can consider, right? So on the left-hand side, if you talk about leadership and culture as an enabler, back to the point on, does it really matter? Statistics show that it does, right? Data as enabler, how do you use data to help you in effective IR management, stakeholder management? We've also got some insights. In addition to that, if we move to the next slide, on the left-hand side, we have also shared what are the matrices that you can consider, right? And because this is not regulated per se, right? It's not like capital ratios or liquidity ratios from those in the banking industry, right? Bank Negara wants to look at it, right? These are sort of internal targets that you may want to consider. And I think it's very important, right? It needs to be built into our KPIs. It needs to be built into our culture, taking into consideration what Dom said as part of chapter 3, that investor relations is not just the responsibility of the one poor being called the head of investor relations, but across the organization and how it permeates across your culture and your own DNA. Right. And if you see on the right hand side, the tools and technologies as enablers, right? Do not underestimate the power of the information that you have on your website, right? The power of Google that will take your potential investors, your current investors, institution investors to your website. Does it portray the similar image that you have as part of your branding, as part of your communication lens, as part of your stakeholder management? So don't forget, that is 24/7. Anytime, anybody can look at your website. In comparison to, say, if you have an AGM, it's once a year, you probably spend 2-3 hours with the people that you speak to, right? So it's important, and these surveys actually demonstrate the importance of it, right? And how that IR websites actually topped the list of the so-called enabling technology, right? Yeah, okay. If we then move to the next slide, please. Yep. These are the enablers, or rather the considerations for the enablers that we have also tried to put together in helping you to make this practical for your organization. And the quote on the right-hand side is what I shared earlier on how the head of investor relations in DG in the interview that is included in this chapter has shared her thoughts on how important leadership is in the whole process or whole journey of managing stakeholders and investor relations. So with that, I'll pass back to Dom to take on the rest of the session.
Thanks, Glenda. So that's how we've put together, the book 3, the 6 chapters. Obviously, we are speeding through, the key essence of the book. There are obviously much more detailed materials in the book itself. And please, for those who are again would like to know more, do go to the Bursa website. Again, it's easily downloadable and so forth. Yeah, and we'll continue obviously to build content. As this program, is over a period of 5 years. I think one of the things, please, I've noticed some of the questions coming in. If you have any questions or even say comments, you want to share your insights, right? Please do. I think as Aina kind of said earlier, this is really an open forum for us to share, to help, build the ecosystem better and enhance the ecosystem within PLCs. Yeah. So without wasting any more time, we're gonna get to the session number 3. And like I said, very fortunate to get Rizal here this morning in his nice batik shirt. Rizal, I think over to you, right? I think really for you to share from KWAP's perspective, what do you look for in terms of the companies that you're targeting, and your view as to how investor relations play an important conduit to kind of engage with KWAP and so forth. Over to you, Rizal.
Thanks, Dom. Thank you, Bursa Malaysia, for inviting me to participate today. I would like to begin by sharing our shareholder activism approach. If you can show page 2 of the slide, please. Yep, this one. There are 6 main channels that we adopted. First is via senior management engagement. This is where our senior management engage directly with the investing company's senior management. The engagement touch on financial and non-financial matters, including business plans and ESG issues. While I acknowledge that there are many facets of what needs to be communicated as mentioned in Guidebook 3 that Dom has taken us through, for our engagements, in addition to what the company intends to present, we specifically mention what we would like to be included as part of the presentation. Could be areas of concern, prevailing issues, including ESG issues, and also gaps in their reporting, which we benchmark against best industry practice. During our engagements, we touch base with the various departments in investing companies. This will provide us to some extent a crucial indication of the culture, including if they have good governance in place. We also look for transparency in their presentations and disclosures. And here is where if the IR team approach this well, it will help to build trust between the investor and also the investee. We also engage via ESG-focused investments. This is led by KWAP's dedicated responsible investment team. This is focused purely on ESG and enables us to deep dive into ESG matters. For the ESG engagements, we will forward our questions to the PLCs, benchmark against GRI standards before the engagement itself. And we expect them to take us through the questions during the engagement sessions. In addition, as shown on the slide, we also participate in EGMs, analyst briefings, ad hoc engagements promptly whenever there are ESG concerns and controversies. We also do joint engagements with the Malaysian Institutional Council. As stated on slide number 3, as far as our source of information for the company, is via annual reports, post-engagement reports, which we prepare internally based on the notes from our engagement sessions. We also look at the publicly disclosed information on the company's website and media reports. In addition, we also look at information from rating agencies, content providers, government agencies' data, studies conducted by third parties, for example, NGOs, and we also get updates provided by the PLCs. But I would like to emphasize here that these are all one-way communication. And since responsible investors like us look beyond the confines of financial reporting since way back in 2009, we recommend two-way communication between the PLCs and the investors, whereby the IR team disseminate information, but also seek input from us on their concerns and expectations. For slide number 4, I will touch on what, in our opinion, should be the core purpose of the IR function. I think the guidebook summarized the core purpose very well. Build trust by investors, which I touched on earlier, keep the investors informed, give confidence to the company's board and senior management, and also improve transparency. A point I would like to emphasize here, that for institutional investors, given our large shareholding over long-term investment horizon, trust is an important purpose which should be based on investor-investee relationship, which may be achieved via regular two-way communication by the IR team. In addition to the purpose that was mentioned in the book, I think IR also needs to manage the perception and sentiment of stakeholders. Further to that, I would like to mention that the phrase bridging the gap describes their role well, whereby IR can play a strategic role and provide the bridge between the company, including your board, and also investors like us. If performed well, I feel that IR can positively manage our sentiments, especially when there are rapport and trust already established over time. In a nutshell, what we look for are information that will enable us to make informed investment decisions, which are number 1, reliable, number 2, trustworthy, verified data, and with all the communication policies and procedures put in place, the company should be able to handle any inevitable future issues, as we have seen in some PLCs. Third one is, I would like to touch on how PLCs can handle the IR section better to gain attract our attention. We have noticed that PLCs have various ways to place the IR function in the organization. But from my observation during our engagements, PLCs who assign more senior person to the IR function facilitates our engagement, whereby we are able to obtain first-hand information from such person. This improves timeliness and also close the gap between our engagement with your senior management, whereby the IR person can provide the details, including areas on feasibility, financial strategy and operations, including issues and constraints they face, and also high-level commitments, which will then be aligned with the subsequent information we get from the C-suite. Again, this is a very important element that will improve timeliness, because I feel that for IR, prompt dissemination of information is very crucial. We also notice that companies that have good stakeholder management are able to manage and recover from crisis faster. Dom and Glenda touched on crisis management earlier. And I would like to add that it can help to prevent miscommunication and also counter false reporting levied against the company. However, for this to be effective, there needs to be trust established between the PLC and investors prior to the crisis, rather than as a response to the crisis. So this, as what I mentioned, can be achieved via honest and transparent disclosures in the past, which would have already built the rapport. As a pension fund with investments in diversified industries, we do not adopt a one-size-fits-all approach in our engagement strategy. This is in view that, from our opinion, different industries will be exposed to varying levels of risk on the E, S, and G pillars. For example, a financial institution may have a higher risk on may not have a higher risk on labor rights as compared to a plantation company. As such, I would encourage PLCs to conduct a materiality assessment of your ESG risk and share with us your detailed time-bound plan to address such risks. And the risk should also be included in your enterprise risk management, as mentioned in the Guidebook 3. This is also where engagements will enable PLCs to convince the stakeholders like us that the risks are addressed, thus mitigating our financial and reputational risks. From my experience, PLCs that only focus and disclose risks that they've already addressed, which is what Glenda touched on earlier about only disclosing the good news. So PLCs that do not disclose the risk that they are not able to address or they have not identified will erode our confidence. And this will be taken into account when we make our investment decision-making process. Investing companies should adopt a proactive communication on both financial and non-financial data. And I would like to further highlight what I mentioned earlier about transparency. So you do not only disseminate positive results, but also latest issues and crises via a full and frank disclosure. And also addressing and disclosing issues as and when they arise on a piecemeal basis will also erode our confidence and will lead to our concern on integrity issues and your governance pillar. For example, in cases where, say for example, your product is subjected to withhold release order or export restriction, it is advisable for you to share with the investors the actual rectifications that you need to be done once you get the details, and also your time-bound commitment to do the rectifications. A point I would like to stress is we have companies across various industries, and we benchmark our company's practices against their peers in similar industries. So to get our interest, being the best in class in the industry will make you stand out and would fit well into our long-term investment horizon. To be the best in class, you should aspire to fulfill beyond minimum requirement in addition to meeting the local requirements. And you also need to be well-versed with the expected practices at the jurisdictions you operate in your export markets. Do we have time for me to proceed further, Dom?
Yes, we do. Please resolve.
Okay, all right. My fourth point is about gaining information from our investing companies. Here, I would like to say that as more and more institutional investors adopt responsible investing, and for KWAP, since we have set up a sustainable investing unit, a responsible investing unit, there's more heightened scrutiny on the PLCs. Hence, we need more engagements, more reporting to be scrutinized, and two-way communication needs to be improved. We've noticed that larger companies have improved in their reporting disclosure, but we receive feedback from the smaller companies that due to their limited resources, the smaller and mid-cap companies are not at par with the bigger companies. And thus, we recommend for the small and mid-cap companies to dedicate more personnel to look into sustainability and build your internal capabilities in this space. Second one is we feel that the information needs to be consistent rather than to be disclosed to only certain groups or media, which are then not consistently picked up by the various analysts. It then creates an issue of the stakeholders having to reach out to the IR to verify. So time again is an important element, and by the time we get the info, sometimes the issue would have become a major one. From my observation, in terms of the scope of the information disclosed, information on governance and social pillars are relatively easier to be obtained as compared to those on climate change. For example, measurement of emissions. So I think this is because PLCs are at varying levels of addressing climate change issues from my engagements with the PLCs. Hence, this is where I feel the IR team can step in and better manage the investors' expectations and be proactive in updating the investors on your aspirations, your time-bound commitment, and also share with us limitations you may face in conducting climate change-related initiatives and reporting. And then finally, on the do's and don'ts, we are consistently mindful of the risk of greenwashing. Hence, while the IR team should ensure that they provide information in a timely manner, I would like to emphasize that the information should have independent verification and assurance by an accredited third party. I would like also to summarize the examples of the do's and don'ts. Firstly, there are some companies that do not disclose issues which are later on exposed by authorities or NGOs. There are PLCs who deny it and later admitting it. There are also PLCs that admit but do not disclose the full extent of the issues. This will lead to concerns over your integrity and ultimately our concerns on your governance, which is the third important pillar. And finally, those who are not able to provide prompt information and updates, even though when there are ESG-related crises or concerns in the market, this may lead to the issue not being well addressed by the PLCs. And finally, if I can touch on digital enhancement, on embracing technology, Dom and Glenda has touched on this earlier. I would like to elaborate further that, add further that while the conventional way is to report via annual reports and media release, it's important, we've mentioned this in our previous CO letter, it's important for the investing companies to embrace innovation, digitalization and technology and updates via social media. I can safely say that investors also obtain news via social media. Hence, it's important that the investing companies can provide your clarification via equally prompt channels to ensure that we obtain a comprehensive update from both sides to enable us to make better informed and unbiased decisions. While the PLCs are encouraged to use such channels, you should also track and monitor negative news made against your company. This is specifically mentioned in the Guidebook 3 under the phrase of listening tools and sentiment analysis, which I think the PLC should seriously look into. In addition, we welcome the hybrid and virtual investor seminar as what we're having today, as it will help us to better manage our time and engagement with more companies, as compared to only physical meetings. Also, by making it available for future reference, it will help us to retrieve and also to refer to the information for our future reference. I agree with the statement in the guidebook that social media is no longer an optional channel, which was mentioned earlier as well. And I feel that more importantly, this is also to ensure that if there's any false information, the market will not make a knee-jerk reaction on the false news. And it's good that we get clarification, prompt clarification by the IR team. As a conclusion, adopting technology is an important tool to manage financial risk and ensure that investors like us are guided by accurate, verified news, and which are accurate and disseminated in a timely manner. So that's all from me today. Over to you, Tom.
Hey, thanks, Rizal, for the sharing. That's very, very insightful. Thanks again. I'm just mindful of time. I know we have this until 11:30. I'm just checking. I mean, any questions from the floor, audience, or you want to share your view? Please, please do. Right. But before we'll run this simultaneously, waiting for the questions to come in. But just on one point that I guess Rizal touched on, obviously, I think from KWAP's perspective, there is a lot of focus obviously on ESG and sustainability as an agenda. For those again who may be new to the PLCT program, there are 5 books over the course of the year. Book 4 and 5 is being developed as we speak. But on book 2 is actually on the topic of ESG and sustainability, right? And a lot of things that I think Rizal has mentioned on, you can actually make reference or again get to Guidebook 2, right, to deep dive a bit more. Yeah. Now, whilst we are waiting for the question to come in, and again, I'm just monitoring time. Yeah. We have two more mentee questions, and ladies and gentlemen, you need to get into a new code, right? If you don't mind, maybe just one, depending on time, we see whether we can do the second one. But on the first one, if you do have time, can you just maybe log on to Mentee again to see, to answer the question? And here again, we just want to gauge as to, from your own perspective, obviously leading on from question 1 and question 2, whether do you employ certain measures in terms of how do you manage, your stakeholder management and your IR programs in your company, right? Can we just get some of the voting started? Thank you. So just to reiterate, this is not meant to be good or bad. It's just to give a flavor as to where we are, right? And obviously, I hope that from the sharing, there are 1 or 2 attributes that when you self-reflect, we think that, hey, this could be actually relevant for us. And that 1 or 2 items could help, in many ways. Thank you, Yam. I think it's very consistent, obviously, with question number 2, depending on how, IR is institutionalized within your organization. And again, to kind of bring it forward in terms of how you measure the program, right, that there is a correlation to it. So based on the responses so far, it is good to know, right, certain companies do have a selection of measures, which is outcome driven and activity driven. And some, again, I think it's just a selection of the measures itself. So column 1 and column 2, which is really, really nice. And I think for column number 3, it is an opportunity to build upon it in terms of what we've shared today. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, just really the last question for the day. Maybe for those who have kind of deployed and implement stakeholder management and IR activities, right? Again, just to gauge, what are some of, maybe from your own lens and reflecting on it, what are some of the benefits, you think you've gotten at the end of the day, right? To bring some color to the question. Well, it's quite balanced. It's quite nice to know, right? And as you can see, I think the benefits varies. It's not just about disseminating, right, and managing external stakeholders. It's also about internalizing it accordingly as well, right? On the last column, in our discussion with board members, I think they have raised, as well as they're sitting on boards, the better interaction with the IR officer in terms of them sharing their view, and again, the views from IR officers, as a conduit to the market, for them to again to perform their oversight duty more effectively as well, right? Obviously, having something institutionalized helps you to optimize your IR resources accordingly. I think we spoke about, obviously, dissemination of information. And I think on the column number 1, quite nice, right? It's also about knowing and anticipating, right? I think we've kind of emphasized on this along the way. It's just not waiting for questions to come, but again, anticipating the process, of what to release. And I think Riza has also touched on this quite a fair bit in his sharing from KWAP's lens, yeah? So, okay, sorry, there's one, let me just check, yeah? So we do have a question, right? And the question is basically, hi, it was mentioned that IR can be automated. Would you be able to elaborate how this can be done? Okay, sure. Let me just close this. When we talk about automation, again, it's very specific in many ways, right? It is not a particular one activity that binds everything together. So again, if you look at, say, some of the things that we shared, and automation can be seen in many forms, right? Obviously, one of the things that we take cognizance of the last 2-3 years, with the entire situation, is the use of virtual AGMs, right? So again, that's how technology is being deployed from an IR perspective. Again, if I were to use a different example as well, I'm just quoting, say, for example, how DG has automated part of the investor relations activities, right? So as part of helping, investors to understand, the company performance better, I think in their website, they've kind of formulated a particular tool or a platform that as an investor, I can get in there, right? Use the platform to actually kind of analyze the performance of the company for me to make an informed decision. So there are many conduits and ways in terms of how technology is actually deployed from an investor relations activity perspective. Is what we mean, right? The other thing is also social listening. And I'm pretty sure a lot of us, right, we track what are the news out there with regards to our own institution, right? Whether it's via social media and so forth. And what's the process of, again, not just listening to what's out there, but using those information to actually help us plan, intervene, to Glenda's point earlier, if it's a situation, how do you then form a holding statement accordingly and so forth? So it is a myriad of technology that needs to be deployed from an IR activity perspective. So the book over the 6 chapters talks about how technology and tools are being infused, right, in the entire book. Things like even podcasts, investor community, pack investor community. I think Nestle did it as an example, if I recall, in many of the case studies. So there are many tools, technologies being deployed, to help maximize the potential of investor relations activities. I hope that answers the question. Now, if there's no more question, again, I'm just very mindful of time. Oh, sorry, there's another question. Rizal, maybe this is something for you, right? So the question is from Adeline. You mentioned there's two-way communication to update and engage stakeholders, right? Is conducting an analyst briefing on a quarterly basis good enough? Maybe just to get your view. Yeah.
Yeah, good question. Very practical as well. Yeah. Firstly, quarterly basis might not be able to address issues that are time sensitive. So, by the time you provide your clarification on the issue, it would have affected your share price, would have had repercussions on your company. And secondly, from what I observed, and this briefing is normally attended by various investors. Hence, you might not be able to get the specific expectations and also concerns by the respective investors, especially your institutional investors, which might have a bigger shareholding, and it will not be able to provide your IR with a clearer view as to what is our expectation. It tends to be more one way. Thank you.
Thanks, Rizal. I think we have a question from Tan Sri Ahmad. Tan Sri, would you like to ask your question, Tan Sri? Jason, maybe can you unmute Tan Sri?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Tan Sri, good morning.
Yeah, yes, very interesting sharing today. Obviously, the huge challenge is basically like what we highlighted is the leadership and culture, in driving up the awareness and the adoption of IR in corporate world. I'm very interested to have a feel of how well or how Malaysia in our corporate world in Malaysia compared with the other countries, let's say around ASEAN. Do you have some data or some sharing on that, Dom? Thank you.
We do have some study, Tan Sri, and in general, I think from what we've actually came about is that I think in terms of the behaviors and the culture to share, I think we do realize that some of our counterparts they do they are a bit more better in doing that in short, Tan Sri, right? And again, it goes back to even when we spoke with, say, for example, Mark Laudy, right? Again, he's experienced in dealing with many CEOs, out there, and again, he works with a lot of CEOs in Malaysia as well. And one of the things that he shared is that in Malaysia, right, we are very shy in sharing, our culture, right?
Yeah. This is what I'm leading to my next question. Actually, I think this is where I think more can be done by engaging the right ministry or right agency in the government to highlight this aspect. I believe that it's just not at the level of a company or like yourself or KWAP just now, for example. I think more can be done to raise this up at a higher level. I'm not sure who should be doing that, but I think it's worth an effort to consider. Thank you. That's all.
Thanks, Tan Sri. Thank you for your input. Definitely, it is a learning curve for all of us, and really the spirit that we want to help, obviously, elevate this to the next level. Sorry, there are a few more questions coming in. Let me just try to go through. Sorry, Arif, you have a question. Is it Arif? I'm just going through the list here. Jason, do you mind unmuting Arif? Hi, Arif. Do you have a question, Arif?
Perhaps you want to take the next written question, meanwhile?
Okay, all right, sure. So there's another question here, right? companies expect to engage with retail investors on a regular basis, aside from EGMs? How do you manage your balance engagement with them to provide comments which can be perceived as harassment? Now, again, this is speaking from, maybe let me answer this, right? I think, when we spoke with some of the IR practitioners out there, again, I think regular is depending on the circumstance of the company itself. And here again, I'm quoting in some way, again, in our understanding and discussion with the head of investor relations in Sunway, they do take certain effort in engaging retail investors accordingly to disseminate the right information out there. So again, the way they do it may be slightly different from other companies as well. So it goes back to the point in terms of, again, how do you prioritize and what's the right manner in terms of how you want to engage those retail investors, yeah? And like I said, this is coming from practitioners themselves. That it's not just focusing on one stakeholder, but other stakeholders similarly. Yeah. Maybe one final question, right? And this may be result very directed to you, right? Would KWAP be interested to invest in a smaller company? In short, right? Maybe just to since, yeah, again, the question again, in the KWAP's focus on smaller companies, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Good question. Just to clarify, we also invest in non-listed companies under our private equity investment. So, feel free to, drop us information and we will look into it, subject to meeting our investment criteria. Thank you.
Thanks, Rizal. And maybe really the final question for the day. Catherine, and your questions on stakeholder engagement on ESG matters. Catherine, may I ask you, if you haven't had the chance, right, do have a look at book 2. Within book 2, there are a lot of templates, tools surrounding how do you do stakeholder, again, on the ESG agenda side of things. Hopefully, they will answer. And sorry, Aina, you wanted to say something?
So no, go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
If I can further add to that, Dom, in terms of book 2, I would like to say that from a practical perspective, it answers a lot of questions that we obtain from our investee companies as far as measuring their carbon emissions, climate change reported disclosure. So it's very timely for Bursa to come up with book 2 and now book 3 as well. Thanks.
Okay. So with that, I think that comes to an end of our webinar today. Maybe I'll pass it back to Anne. Thank you very much for again, for spending your time in the morning and for your questions. And I hope, this is really a learning experience for all of us as well. Aina, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much. I know we're a little bit over time, but I do will be mindful to have a little more time for questions and answers later. The slides will be sent to registered participants of the webinar. We did see some questions there. And thereafter, actually, for all the past sessions, in case you missed book 1, book 2, or when you speak with your co-workers, and also when we do book 4 and 5, all the recordings will also be available on the website. So first, thank you all for your time in listening. Bursa, we do write to my team at PLCT@bursamalaysia.com if you have specific, topics, let's say for next year, that you'd like us to, help bring some experts or sharing, or if you as a PLC would like to share with others to help make us all on this collective journey to be better together. When we'll be reaching out, with you, with each company from time to time, just to check in to see, how have you improved in which area that you have taken some action just to get the momentum going. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. PwC, and especially thank you to Rizal.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good